Shavua Tov. I want to pick up where we left off last time talking about Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And before getting into some additional comments today, I think it's important to summarize the main argument from last time because it was a little wild. But basically, what we're trying to propose is that Avraham deliberately brought Yitzchak close to the point of being sacrificed, not because he had some booming voice in his head telling him he had to, even though that made no sense, but rather because he was trying to grapple with a contradiction in the instructions that he felt he'd been given by Hashem in how to raise Yitzchak to adulthood. That Yitzchak and he had lived in the land of the Plishtim for a long time, and it came to the point of who is going to be the wife for Yitzchak. And the choice seemed to be to Avram to let him marry within Eretz Canaan, or Eretz HaPlishtim, where they're living, and therefore marry women from this idolatrous sort of enemy nation. Or, on the other hand, to not allow him to marry, and then therefore essentially to make a kind of a sacrifice out of him by ruining his life for the sake of this kind of purity or higher commitment. And not even just that, but to, in the process, derail the whole project that they're a part of, right? The idea ultimately is to create a nation that serves Hashem, but you can't create a nation without marriage. So Avram was facing this contradiction, which ultimately will be resolved at the end of the Akeda by being told that Rivka exists, by lifting Avram's eyes to the possibility of marrying Yitzchak to someone outside of the place where they're living. But then he has to push things to the point of showing Hashem, you've made me put my son on an altar for sacrifice because you're not letting me have any option for how to proceed, right? He both needs to marry and can't get married. So it was kind of what we want to argue is that it was a kind of a deadly or potentially deadly pageant that Avram was performing in order to make Hashem show him the way that's different, right? Saying, look, according to my understanding, the way I have to serve you is I have these two different things and they both seem wrong. So I have to pick one of them. And then by doing so, you're going to be forced to show me that there's a third way. And the third way was symbolically represented by the ram, because the ram with its horns that it uses to fight to find a mate is caught in place by its horns, and they're sort of the horns of a dilemma. But if you free the horns, then the ram isn't stuck where it is, and it doesn't become a sacrifice anymore. In other words, if you expand beyond the locale, right, if you're not geographically stuck, then suddenly you have an option. And so it was really assigned to Avram to look beyond the place where they were stuck. And indeed, that's what he did with Rivka. Now, the point is that that way of imagining things is understanding the binding of Yitzchak not to be simply tying him up, and it just means, a way of tying him to put him on the altar. But this word akod, as we found actually in this other passage about about Yaakov Avinu doing his animal husbandry, it really means a way you tie up a sheep in order to regulate its ability to mate, right? What Yaakov is doing is he's selecting who gets to mate with whom. And in the process, there's a way you tie sheep in order to do that. And that's where this word akod is appearing. And so that completes the picture. It's like, when Avram is binding Yitzchak, it's really binding him as one would bind a sheep that you're trying to prevent from mating with this person so that you can or mating with this sheep so that you can force them to mate with that sheep. And then that's all part of this demonstration to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that this is how Avram feels, and now he needs a solution. Right? So that's the summary of the argument, which I think that once you take you step away from the details, and maybe it's also worth mentioning those details are very supported by the fact that Yitzchak parallels Shimshon in many ways. Shimshon lived near Aza and married a Plishite woman against his parents' wishes. He's eventually blind. He's getting tied up all the time. There are all these different parallels. He's born to a barren woman after an angel tells her that she's going to have a baby. So there's lots of different ways in which Shimshon parallels Yitzchak. And the key thing is that it's much clearer in the case of Shimshon that he marries a Plishti woman, right? So there is a clear possibility of Yitzchak marrying Plishti women that is hiding the background of the story of Yitzchak. And that's really the genesis of, or the driving force for the binding of Yitzchak. But when we take all of that for granted and now say, okay, that is our explanation. That's interesting. That's a different way of looking at the Akeda. Now the question is, what are the implications of that for how we're to learn from Akedat Yitzchak what it is to be an Oved Hashem like Avraham Avinu? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we now have a way of explaining Akedat Yitzchak that doesn't require the sort of the narrative element of the voice of Hashem speaking into Avram's ear. That there's a reason that Avram might have done this. That's sort of something that he derived from his own understanding of what Hashem wanted from him, or that's part of his dialogue with Hashem to help him gain better understanding. But does that just mean now it's, a story among many that this happened and that's why Avram did it and now we move on? I don't think it's just that. I think that the power of reading the story this way is that it unlocks much more general lessons about how we are to understand what it is to serve Hashem and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants his nation of priests, his Mamlechet Kohanim and Goy Kadosh, his holy nation, to serve him, right? That if you're a real Oved Hashem, if you're a real servant of Hashem, how should you handle the fact that sometimes Hashem gives you seemingly conflicting instructions or demands? Because that's the essence of the Akedah. That's the thing that we retain from the outset. The simplest reading of the Akedah is Hashem says, go kill your son and make a sacrifice of him. But also, since we know it's Hashem, we know that child sacrifice is abhorrent and forbidden. So those seem to be two different things that Hashem is saying that are completely opposite. And how can we resolve that, right? There's a fundamental contradiction seemingly between two different things that Hashem is saying to Avram. Here's how you serve me. And that we retain now, but carry forward in a more general way. We found a different version of that contradiction saying, okay, Yitzchak needs to get married, but he also can't get married, right? That's another version of that. The horns of the dilemma, the horns of the ram that are caught in the thicket, that's how that ends up being captured emblematically in the story. So what we're now, I think, able to derive from this is two different kinds of lessons. One of them, I think we allow Yitzchak to remain a person in the story. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that this is a comment about is actual relationships between the parents and the children, or between people, a servant of Hashem and another person who's involved in the story. And in an interesting way, I think it takes maybe ideas that you might say come up in Kantian philosophical discussions, and it takes them to a higher level because Torah can always give a more sophisticated treatment than Western philosophy of some of the interesting subjects that Western philosophy sometimes takes up. So in particular, what I'm interested in here is the idea of seeing a person as a means versus as an end in himself, right? That there is a kind of discussion you get from Western philosophy that people, I think, often trace the discussions in Kant, which is that there is a temptation in many circumstances to see all the different things that you have laid before you as means to some ends, and you could grab onto objects and use them as means, but you also can use people as means. But that there's something about personhood that has to have a kind of a special, separate classification, and people shouldn't themselves be treated as means. They should be treated as ends in themselves. That there is a way in which you should somehow be setting your goals so that the ultimate end locates itself in the flourishing or the success or the development of the person, as opposed to seeing that as just a tool that you use to achieve some other objective. I think I'm right in remembering that that's attributed to Kantian thought, but I may be making a mistake about that. In any case, it's a common notion, even in modern discussions. But I think what's very interesting about how the Akeda, as we're reading it now, handles that issue is that Yitzhak clearly is, at some level, at risk of being treated as a means here. Certainly, human sacrifice is the ultimate way of treating a person as a means, right? And in the pagan sense of it, it's like, this person I need, this is a person I need to kill in order to get what I want from the gods. And so I will use this person accordingly because I have no other choice. And that's very often the argument that's made for human sacrifice, is that there are these situations in which you have no choice but to, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs, like that kind of a reasoning where even if we might otherwise prefer not to kill people, in some cases we have no choice because of what we get out of it. We're going to save everyone by making the sacrifice to the gods or whatever. And then in modern terms, there are other versions of that may not make reference to gods explicitly. But what I think is more complicated about this when we view it in the standpoint, or from the standpoint of the Akeda, is that Yitzhak also is a means in a way that we have, less of an easy time questioning, insofar as he's part of this project that Avraham has been working on to serve Hashem by creating this nation, right? That Avraham is trying to serve Akadosh Baruch Hu. He has realized through what Akadosh Baruch Hu has taught him that he needs to create this priestly nation to bring mankind to humanity. In order to do that, he has to have a son, and then his son has to have a son, right? And we know how the narrative all plays out. But that means that insofar as Avraham is trying to serve Hashem through Yitzhak, Yitzhak is a means, right? He's not just a son that Avraham loves. He's a way of creating a nation. And if Avraham is totally obsessed with serving Hashem above everything else, he still wants Yitzhak to survive and flourish and exist because Yitzhak is a means to achieving that goal. And so in those terms, what the Akeda is bringing up now is it's saying, well, what should Avram's ultimate ends be, right? What is the goal that Avram should be ultimately focused on? Should his ultimate goal be his son as an end in himself? Because at first that sounds good and sounds nice, and that would certainly, get you an A- in a moral reasoning class at some, present day Western university, or maybe they're doing even fancier things now, but that's a common way of thinking and talking in the modern Western world. But it actually, from the standpoint of the Torah, maybe is somewhat problematic, because the ultimate end should be Hashem, right? The Torah says, "Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha," right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your being, however you want to translate that, right? That there's something totalizing about the devotion to Hashem that the Torah is enjoining upon Am Yisrael, and Avraham is certainly the paragon of that, the progenitor of that whole way of operating. And so if that's the case, then Yitzhak can't be the ultimate end. And perhaps if loving and serving Hashem is the ultimate end, then maybe it is appropriate to say, so what's wrong with Yitzhak being a means to serving Hashem, right? What's wrong with saying, okay, I want to serve Hashem above everything. So if I'm going to serve Hashem above everything, then it's okay to make even people means to that. But, of course, that raises the specter of human sacrifice. And that's what Akadosh Baruch Hu, then you could say, with the Akeda, is kind of trying to illustrate, and the Torah is illustrating with great subtlety, that on the one hand, it is right that Avram wants to see serving Hashem as the ultimate end, and that therefore, at some level, a person such as Yitzchak can, in a way, be a means to that ultimate end. And on the other hand, that's only true in a context where Kadosh Baruch Hu does not allow and does not actually want the sacrifice of Yitzchak, who is a person, right? Serving Hashem and human sacrifice do not mix together well, right? So if you pick the wrong thing as your ultimate end, you will be on a fast track to human sacrifice. That's part of the lesson of the Torah, right? And people who, for example, worship false gods but serve them as ultimate ends end up deciding, we want to serve our God and set nothing higher than him. And so let's go have a bunch of suicide bombings because that kind of human sacrifice fits into our plan for using people as means to that ultimate end, right? That we see in the world happening all the time. And it's because people are serving a false God while they're doing that, right? But if you're serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then you can make him the ultimate end. And what we're seeing in the Akeda is he does not desire Yitzhak as a sacrifice, ultimately. But he does desire from Avram that Avram make HaKadosh Baruch Hu the ultimate end. And so there has to be this kind of narrative resolution of that, where on the one hand, Avram is rewarded for his willingness to see Hashem as the ultimate end and say, look, you gave me Yitzhak, but it's not really for me to say whether you should take Yitzhak back if that serves you as the ultimate end. And on the other hand, HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately has to say, okay, but you're serving me. And if you're serving me, I don't want people to be used as means in that way. And so I support your making me the ultimate end, but I reject the claim someone might make that in that case, we should be using people as means that therefore can be sacrificed to me, right? That the claim then would be that the way Hashem has created the world and the way he wants us to keep the Torah, there will not arise circumstances in which he demands human sacrifice as something that one goes through with and performs in order to demonstrate that you see him as the ultimate end. But he does want you to see him as the ultimate end, and so there's this balance that has to be struck between the sort of praxis and the real necessities of how to act in the world in order to serve Hashem properly, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the discussion of principle. At some level, the discussion of principle can be very simple, and you can say, look, there is only one ultimate end, and that's Avodat Hashem. And so it's not really correct to say people should be ends in themselves because, well, which people? I mean, how do you make more than one person an end in himself and resolve those contradictions? And are you making someone an end in himself instead of making HaKadosh Baruch Hu an end? And are you going to start trying to use Hashem as a means to help the people that you make as ends in themselves? Because things can start flowing in that other direction as well. People try to use religion as a kind of magic to improve their lives and the lives of their family and children. And that can go pretty wrong pretty rapidly as well. So I think that's one aspect that's kind of interesting here. But I also think that there's another level of reading it where if we get a little bit more abstract, there's also a way in which you could say the Akeda is riffing on things we hear kind of coming from Buddhism and saying, this isn't quite right, but here's how we, say something more sophisticated that makes, aligns with Torah. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's Yitzchak. Yitzchak is a person, right? But there's also the more general abstraction of saying, what is a son? What is a child? It's a creation that comes from you that like begins with a seed and then flourishes and becomes its own thing and goes out in the world and has all these downstream consequences, right? And so if you think abstractly of the idea of masculinity biologically as being the source of the seed, and then there's a womb in which that gestates and it leads to a new creation, that can become a metaphor for lots of things that people do in the world, male and female, right? That we go around in the world and we do things, and we're always kind of planting seeds or lighting a little fire that could spread and that could transform and rearrange the world and its surroundings. Like everything is a butterfly effect at the first flapping of the wings, and then there's all the consequences that come afterwards. And we try to produce the effects that we want. We don't always produce the effects that we want, but we're attempting to exert some control with the world by sort of planting the seed here and then seeing what it grows into and how it develops. And so in that regard, we have the opportunity to see Akedat Yitzchak as being a discussion of what it is to take your ability to bring things about in the world and reflect on your attachment to it, which is how we kind of are going to get into the discussion of how this is relevant to at least, simple glosses on Buddhism. How do you take your attachment to that thing and weigh that against the divine command? So if we go to the beginning of Akedat Yitzchak, it starts, Vayehi ahar hadvarim ha'ele ve'Elohim nisa et Avraham vayomer elav Avraham vayomer hineni. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Avraham and said to him, Avraham, and he said, behold, I am here. Vayomer kach na et bidcha et yehidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak ולך לך אל ארץ המוריה, והערהו שם לעונה על אחד ההרים אשר אומר אליך. And he said to him, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell you. What I want to just focus on here is et bincha, et yehidcha, asher ahavta, et Yitzchak, right? So Yitzchak is the actual person, but everything before that is like abstract characterizations of what Yitzchak is. He's a son. He's an only one, Yehid, whatever that means. And he's the one you love. So what are those three things? I want to talk about the son as the idea of the sprouting seed, right? Like he is an offshoot of your influence that could go out in the world and have consequences, and hopefully the consequences that you hope and intend, right? So you can think of Yitzchak more generally than being a person as representing something that you have created, right? And that came from you and that represents your influence and sort of is an imprinting of your pattern on the world that can then go out and have consequences. Yehidcha, your only one, I want us to think about Yitzchak's role in the narrative, right? That he's the only way Avraham is going to be able to create this nation that he's trying to create for the sake of serving Hashem. So in that sense, he's the only apparent means of accomplishing Avraham's goal of serving Hashem. And Asher Ahavta, it's about his affection for him. That we don't just create things in the world, whether it's a person, like whether it's like having a child, or it's a company you founded, or it's an invention that you developed, or it's a book that you wrote, or whatever it is, right? A field you planted, that let's say is your ben, it's your son, and it comes from you and you created it. And it may also be the only means that you see available to do something that you're doing because you're trying to serve Hashem, right? And that could apply to any of those things we just listed. Maybe you planted the field because the only way you know how to feed your family or bring offerings in the temple or whatever it is that you've decided, like, this is the mitzvah that I'm trying to do right now. I need the crops from this field in order to do that. Or I need this book that I'm writing to be finished so that I can, get paid for my contract or whatever it is. Like, all these different things people do for thousands of years, from a long time ago to modern times. Everyone has things that at some point they say, this is my only means for doing whatever it is I'm trying to do. And then every Oved Hashem, he's trying to serve Hashem, and he's going to have things that he sees as the only efficient or effective means for accomplishing whatever that goal is. But then there's Asher Ahavta, that you love it, that we have emotional attachment to and affection for the things that we create, obviously for our children, but also for other things, right? If you have a business that you built over many years, you don't just see it necessarily as a source of money. Maybe it's a source of pride. Maybe it's a source of daily enjoyment. Maybe it's something that you think of as lasting in the world beyond your presence in the world, and it'll be a memory to you, or a memory of you to others, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's also the emotional attachment of just, I can't let this go. I need it. I want it. And that's how we get into things that sometimes come up, when you get a simple gloss on Buddhism, there's some presentation of the idea that the way you achieve enlightenment is you take these things that you have attachment to, and you learn how to step beyond that attachment. And then the sort of the bliss of your enlightenment is realizing that your attachment to things in this world was some kind of a misleading illusion, that you thought that the desires you had to acquire things or to control things, or to create things or to have things to enjoy or to hold on to people that you care about, or all of these different things, that's where your passions and your emotions lead you. But if you can achieve the right kind of above it all philosophical perspective, that there's a bliss in having the enlightenment of escaping that sense of attachment, and having some kind of more general equilibrium in your communion with the universe and this world and the beyond, et cetera. And obviously someone can come along and say, you need to study Buddhism a lot more in order to really do it justice. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to say that that's a common enough gloss that people hand around, whether you want to attribute it to Buddhism or not. Some people will tell you that there's an opportunity in trying to achieve that kind of transcendence of attachment. Now, we are talking here about Avram's attachment, right? His ahava, his love, and also not just that, but his perhaps desperation in believing that this thing that he loves is the only means of doing the right thing for the ultimate end, which in this case is Hashem. But in any case, it's like he has this goal and he thinks he needs this thing that he loves in order to achieve the goal. And also it's from him. Like obviously that's part of why he loves it, and maybe why he focuses on it as his only means. But it's there's something very basic about when saying it's his son. It's like we're talking more generally about the things that come from us as mattering. That is the definition of attachment, right? That you don't feel a sense of attachment to the things that you're not involved with, that you didn't participate in creating, that they're not part of your life, because you don't interact with them. And so there's the sense of proximity, and there's the sense of significance and importance, and there's this sense of affection. And all of these are reasons that Avraham would have with respect to Yitzchak, of course, who's his son, whom he loves, right? All of those are reasons he'd want to keep him in the world and hold on to him. But those are also reasons more generally that you might feel that way about, as we said, a lot of things that you would have created because of all that you believe that they are needed for, and because of your affection for them, and your investment of emotion, and because these are the things that have to do with you, and they're the ones you can affect, and they're the ones that seem to you like they should be your focus and your concern. And the either Buddhist or caricatured Buddhist way of talking about this would be to say, what Avram needs to learn is he just needs to relinquish attachment. He hasn't achieved enlightenment if this is difficult for him. But maybe what he's doing, by succeeding in the Akeda, is he is showing that he has transcended attachment, and isn't that a good thing? That he's becoming enlightened and he can just kind of let go of all of that. But I don't think that is exactly the lesson that we get from the Akeda because of the way it resolves the narrative. We get a subtler message that I think steps clear of the sort of hidden perversities of what we're calling the Buddhist position, right? Because relinquishing attachment sounds great if you focus on aspects of it. It's like, oh, now you can be nice to people that you don't know because you don't love them any less or more than anyone else. And now you can be self-sacrificing, and now you can not torment yourself with all of your fears of what might be in the future. So there's this kind of freedom from worry, and there's this peaceful happiness that comes from not having this partiality or concern. But you start to hear like how we're describing it, what the Judaic critique of that would be, which is that if you're losing partiality, you may actually also be losing concern for others that you could have helped. You would have found more of a motivation to help, right? Like if you're very enlightened and you're not leveraging your emotions and your particular concerns, then the idea that you would be only more effective in helping other people is belied by the evidence of human experience. People don't go out and make sure they help people as thoughtfully and energetically when they're trying to be concerned about and to help everyone in the world at once. This is not only a critique of Buddhism, let's say, but also a Judaic critique of versions of Christianity. Certainly, in George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, for example, she writes very beautifully about the problem with universal love from the Judaic perspective, which is that you miss out on the chance to love particular people more because they're your relatives, because they're your nation, and because you love them more, you will end up doing much, much more for someone than you would have done if you kind of felt like a vague, weak inclination to help everyone. And so you have particular people you're concerned for, and it's your job to be extra concerned for them, and you know them well, and you think about how to help them, and you have real motivation to help them. And so there is a kind of perversity in relinquishing attachment when it cultivates a kind of indifference or passivity or, let's say, ineptness in showing specific concern for the well-being of a particular subset of others, and therefore missing the opportunity to really help anyone a lot. And obviously that's also clearer even still when we realize that in the Akeda itself, the achievement of Avraham in relinquishing attachment here would be that he just goes through with it, right? Oh, yeah, God says, sacrifice my son, so I'll sacrifice my son. I'm not attached. I've relinquished attachment. I've achieved some kind of enlightenment. And so now I'm going to go ahead and, sacrifice him because I don't have these things holding me back from doing that. And, well, on the one hand, the Akeda, yes, is about the merit of Avraham, again, being willing to make HaKadosh Baruch Hu the ultimate end. He gets sick pretty quickly if we imagine him saying, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're the ultimate end, so I'll just go ahead and slaughter my son here, and now I'm the hero of the story, right? It doesn't sound that way. It sounds instead like relinquishing attachment opens the door to human sacrifice, and if we, as we should, take the Torah in a straightforward manner and nail down that part of things first and say human sacrifice and child sacrifice are abhorrent to Hashem, always, full stop. The Torah is against it. Then we know we're somehow coming to the wrong conclusion by just saying, wouldn't it be great if Avraham just went through with it and did so with an enlightened bliss because he has relinquished attachment? So there's some problem with just holding that side of things and not considering the broader context that the narrative gives to this whole set of events. what is it that eventually happens? What eventually happens is the ram has its horns caught in the thicket, and Avram sees the ram and replaces Yitzchak with the ram, and that is what he sacrifices to Hashem. And there, I think what we need to do is we need to think about the difference between the ram and Yitzchak, because the ram still is a kind of abstraction of what we're talking about in Yitzchak. What we don't want the story to end with is Yitzchak himself, the person being sacrificed. We want Avram to be able to show that he's willing to take, in abstract terms, his son, meaning this thing that he created, his only means of achieving some goal, perhaps a lofty goal, perhaps serving Hashem, his yachid, right? And something that he loves, something that he has a personal, emotional attachment to, an affection for, that he created. So it's not just coldly and dispassionately that it's his only means and that it's this thing that he created, so he's involved with it, but also that it pains him personally, the idea of losing it. And right, that could apply to the field you planted or the business you started, your invention or your book or whatever else it is. You abstract all of that and you say, that is, all of that, it is good. As a servant of Hashem should be willing to say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you are the ultimate end, and I will set all of those things aside. I will show you that for your sake, I will be willing to take all of those things and set them aside. Not to actually do a human sacrifice, but to sort of take the son, only one, and that which I love, abstract it, have it apply to all sorts of things we could be involved with doing, and say, I need to show my willingness sometimes to take something with that much going for it and just say, for Hashem's sake, I will give it up. And what the ram does is it represents exactly that kind of substitution. Because what is the ram? The ram is this male sheep that has horns, right, that it uses to fight in order to mate. And so going back to this idea of the son being the seed that you plant in the world to produce consequences, the ram is even about this idea of like fighting to mate in the world, right? It's about the violent struggle of the sort of masculine aspect to impose its influence on the world and produce consequences, hopefully of the kind that you're trying to produce. And the ram is caught by those horns, right? That the horns have it actually turn out to be a snare to the ram. It's stuck. It's trying to do what we're saying the ram represents, but it's not able to succeed because there actually is something kind of contradictory. There are two horns, right? And they are somehow tugging in different directions that you can, in the course of trying to serve Hashem, because that's what Avram's doing, that's what one should be doing, you can find that there's some kind of contradiction that leads you to be unable to go one way or another way. Well, there's some sense in which it's not possible to bring things to a resolution, but the ram is, in principle, kind of a means to producing the result, right? It represents the idea of the possibility of achieving the goal of planting a seed in the world. And that's the thing that gets sacrificed. So what is the text showing us then? What it's saying is that, look, sometimes you're an Oved Hashem, you're a servant of Hashem, you're going to have things that you've created that seem to you to be the only way of doing something that you're trying to do for Hashem's sake, and even that you love and that you have great affection for. Should you just arbitrarily pick moments to destroy these things to show Hashem that if he wants you to destroy them, that you're willing to? That sounds insane. Like, why would you do that? Let's say, you built a thriving business that helps people and gives wealth to your family and your community, and it's all going great. You just burn it down one day to nihilistically demonstrate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you'll let it all go just for him? He doesn't want you to let it go. It's a good thing that you made it, right? So part of what we have to ask is, what is the circumstance in which we should be given the opportunity to show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that kind of liberation from attachment, right? If it's the case that we can't say all attachment is bad, because that's simplistic in this sort of what we're saying is the Buddhist way, because then you just kind of become indifferent and do less and accomplish less in the world and don't help people and all of those things. If attachment actually, Judaically, a lot of the time is good motivation to get the right things done, but if at the same time one wants the opportunity to show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that when it comes to him, and when he is giving you the right kind of message, you do want to demonstrate to him that you will relinquish attachment for his sake, then what is the circumstance in which that arises? And I think that there, what the Ram is showing is it's about competing visions of what it is that you should be doing, right? And that comes back to the beginning of the Akeda. There's two different things that Hashem is saying. Don't sacrifice people and sacrifice Yitzchak. Or let Yitzchak get married, but also don't let him get married, right? We're back to this idea of the horns of the dilemma. So now think of the horns of the dilemma here more generally and say, sometimes there's more than one thing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has commanded you to do, seemingly, and they don't seem to work together, right? They seem to be in some contradiction with each other. And that will happen. That's the interesting thing about the Torah. The Torah is not set up so that in the created world, you automatically get all the time to do all the things you're supposed to be doing without feeling like one thing is getting in the way of the other thing, right? Sometimes in order to save the life of a family member, you have to violate Shabbat, and you're supposed to violate Shabbat. And maybe in that instance, we have halacha, we know what's proper, and we just say, oh, well, in this case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to violate Shabbat. And it's pretty easy to give it up when it's for the sake of this other thing. But sometimes we're in much murkier circumstances where it's like, I am in a unique situation where I have this effort going, where it's my sort of son and only one and something I love. And then I also have another circumstance going on at the same time where there's this other set of efforts that are leading towards serving Hashem in some other way, and they come to some loggerheads or contradiction where I can't do both. And now the question is, what do I do? That's the horns of the dilemma, the contradiction, and what catches the ram in the thicket. And then that's the chance to what? To show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you have Yirat Elohim, that you fear God. That's what ultimately gets said to Avram after the Akeda. Ata yadati ki hare Elohim ata. Lo chasachta et binechat yechidcha mimeni. You didn't withhold your son, your only one, from me. Now I know you're God-fearing. So what is the opportunity here? What it's saying is that when you face such a contradiction where you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do, then think very carefully about which thing you decide to do, right? Like you have two different things that seem both to you to be part of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from you. And it may actually be that in a given circumstance, one of them is easier to give up on, but it might also be the case that the one that Hashem wants you to maybe prioritize is a bit more like the one that you'd really be pained to give up on, right? This thing of the only one, the son, the one you love, not everything that we set in motion in order to serve Hashem equally works that way, right? So there are circumstances where on the one hand, there's something going on over here and you really care about it and you really love it and you're really proud of it. And on the other hand, there's something else going on over here and you kind of say like, well, if everything else were easy, then I would do this thing. But the moment there's a contradiction, maybe I'll incline to just sweep off the table the thing that I like less. But there might actually be a better way of serving Hashem that tries really hard to keep that on the table and puts the other thing at risk, puts the thing at risk that you love, that you care most about. And that is the situation of trust that the Akeda is exploring, because what it's saying is that there's a certain amount of needing to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately knows all that's happening, and he's going to give you the chance to save what you love if it's really right that you love it. But he doesn't want you to use the fact that there's this contradiction between different things you have, all these different pots you have on the stove. He doesn't want you to use the contradiction as a way of simply just ignoring one of the things that he seems to want you to do, because you don't want the pain of putting at risk the thing that really you have this attachment to, right? Especially because sometimes the prioritization doesn't run, the way your attachments do. Like, let's say, one of the things that we're talking about is, you were going to be invited to go to some event where you'd get to, study Torah with people and have a really nice meal together that was part of, celebrating a holiday. And those are all not just things that are part of Avodat Hashem, because learning Torah is part of Avodat Hashem, and feasting in the holidays is part of Avodat Hashem. And there's also things that you really enjoy. Maybe you planned the event, so it's your child, so to speak. You planned the event. If you don't go to this event, you're not going to be able to have a Seder for Pesach this year. And also, you're really going to enjoy all the Talmud Torah and all the sumptuous food. And then something else arises that maybe involves helping a person in need in a way that is defined so that there is an opportunity to do a clear mitzvah from the Torah to help this person in need. But it requires, sacrifice. It requires maybe that it seems like you're not going to be able to do this other thing that you've invested effort in, that you were really looking forward to, that you love the idea of doing, and that is also a mitzvah. Should it be the case that someone they hear the two options and they say, well, I can't help this person because I'm sorry, but I've got to go to this feast. It's a mitzvah. Doesn't quite sound right. And it may be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be very happy for you in this particular instance to just say, look, I get to do a lot of Talmud Torah, I get to do a lot of feasting, and not everything that I plan succeeds. So this time around, this other thing is actually the priority. Now, knowing it's the priority is a complex question, right? It isn't always the case that the thing you want to do less is the more important mitzvah, but it sometimes is the case. And it isn't even the case that ultimately Yitzhak is sacrificed, right? So the point isn't necessarily, all right, you have to just be willing to burn one thing to the ground and do the other thing. It's that you need at least to be comfortable with putting the thing you care about more at risk as well while you're trying to figure out what Hashem really wants from you. And that, I think, is the very general lesson that I think goes beyond and improves on this notion of relinquishing attachment. We need attachment. We want attachment where servants of Hashem who understand from the Torah that properly channeled attachment makes us better servants of Hashem, and it makes us better able to do all the things for each other and for HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we're supposed to do. But there is an element of truth to this idea that truly being committed to serving Hashem does mean being willing to reflect on your attachments and ask when some of them might be needing to be put at risk while you at least are figuring out what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu really wants you to do, and that you're willing to trust Hashem enough that he's not going to make you sacrifice your son, so to speak, but that you have to be willing at least to say, for example, oh, well, maybe I will, move my family to the land of Israel, even though it seems to me like I could make some argument like, oh, sometimes it sounds kind of dangerous there. And I guess, saving life is such an important mitzvah. So I won't go to the land of Israel, and I'll just do what's comfortable and enjoyable here in Florida or wherever it is that I am. Obviously, people have different circumstances, and the decision to make aliyah can be a complicated one. And, it always comes down in halakha to the details of the question an individual finds oneself in. But it's imaginable, right, that someone really what they want is to stay where they are. And they can make up some reason why, oh, yeah, I have this great halachic argument for why I can't make aliyah with my family. And now I'm not going to worry about it anymore, right? It's the idea of resolving the tension and the contradiction easily and dismissively, as opposed to saying, maybe I should be willing to experience a certain kind of risk for the sake of Torah, for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And maybe if I do that, I'll eventually realize Hashem isn't trying to take my child as a sacrifice, so to speak, or the thing that I love as a sacrifice. But really, it's more just that being willing to put it at risk is showing enough willingness to step away from attachment for his sake, that he sees I'm Yireh Elohim, and then actually he gives it back to me. He gives me both things. He gives me bracha on top of that. That is the recommendation that's being made of how to proceed by Akeda Yitzchak. So I think ultimately it becomes a really valuable practical methodology for facing life at every level. Because if you're an Oved Hashem, you're trying to figure out all the time, what does Hashem want me to do? What is the Torah teaching me about how to understand my current moment and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects from me? There will be contradictions. There will be competing visions of what has to happen that are in tension, and you won't be able to always, in a pat way, in a rapid and dismissive way, just resolve them into, nope, this one's better. And even more than that, there is virtue and a higher level of Avodat Hashem in being willing to stop before you pick one fork in the road instead of the other and say, does the fact that I'm picking the one that I want to pick, does that give me pause? Should I be asking whether in this case, this is an instance where HaKadosh Baruch Hu really wants me to sacrifice to him something that seems to me to be the only means of achieving some goal or something that I love, because really there's some other way of serving him that's more important. And I think ultimately, if we live our lives that way, we're not going to discover, oh, well, isn't it great being virtuous that we're constantly taking things we love and burning them to the ground to show Hashem that we care more about him? Because he doesn't want that from us. He wants us to be willing to put those things at risk when we see with clarity that we have to do so in order to give the greatest priority to him. But once we have given him that priority, his goal is not to see us put the things that we love in ruins, but rather to help us to discover a third way that is not either horn of the dilemma that we're caught by, but instead gives us another way of serving him that he gives us as a gift to recognize the step we took in his direction by using our relinquishment of attachment as a tool for demonstrating our commitment to service of Hashem as the highest end.